On June 22, 1941, at dawn, the stillness along the German-Soviet frontier shattered. Thousands of artillery guns opened fire. Luftwaffe bombers roared overhead, and 3 million German soldiers, supported by their Axis allies, poured across an 1,800-mile front. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's colossal gamble to destroy the Soviet Union in a single lightning strike, had begun. The German army divided its vast invasion force into 3 spearheads. Army Group North, tasked with seizing Leningrad; Army Group Center, the largest formation aimed at Moscow; and Army Group South, whose mission was to capture Ukraine and its fertile lands. Behind these objectives lay Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, the conquest of vast territories for German settlement and resources. Yet what unfolded would be a clash of titanic scale, brutal beyond measure, and far longer than the German High Command ever imagined. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Ritter von Leeb, launched its attack from East Prussia and the Baltic states. Its ultimate goal was the city of Leningrad, cradle of the Russian Revolution, industrial powerhouse, and symbol of Soviet resistance. The German advance began with startling speed. The mechanized spearheads of General Erich Huppner's 4th Panzer Group smashed through Soviet frontier defenses, racing northeast. Soviet forces, unprepared, scattered, and hampered by Stalin's refusal to believe war was imminent, fell back in confusion. The Red Air Force, caught by surprise on its airfields, lost thousands of aircraft in the opening days. Yet the advance was not without resistance. Soviet border armies, though poorly coordinated, fought stubborn, delaying battles. In the Baltic states, local populations often greeted the Germans as liberators from Soviet rule. But the Red Army regrouped around Riga and along the Daugava River. Bitter fighting erupted as Soviet tanks and infantry tried desperately to slow the German tide. By late June, Riga fell. The Wehrmacht pressed on relentlessly. By July, Pskov was captured, opening the gateway to Leningrad. But here, the advance began to slow. The Soviets brought in reinforcements, constructing defensive lines along the approaches to the city. Forests, lakes, and poor roads hampered German armor. Though the Germans were closing in, Leningrad would not fall easily. While Army Group North drove toward Leningrad, Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, launched its own offensive into Ukraine. This was the richest agricultural region of the Soviet Union, the breadbasket of Europe. Its capture was essential to Hitler's economic war aims. The Germans, supported by Hungarian, Romanian, and Italian allies, faced the powerful Soviet Southwestern Front. Unlike in the north, here the Red Army was better prepared and resisted with ferocity. The initial battles around Lutsk, Brody, and Dubno became some of the largest tank engagements in history up to that point. Thousands of armored vehicles clashed in chaotic combat across the Ukrainian fields. Although Soviet losses were enormous, they managed to delay the German advance. The fighting drained time and resources, forcing the Wehrmacht into prolonged battles rather than swift breakthroughs. Still, the Germans' superior coordination and air supremacy eventually forced the Soviets into retreat. By July, German spearheads pressed toward Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. Yet Soviet resistance stiffened and enormous battles of encirclement loomed. Hitler demanded the city's capture, and the fighting here would soon become one of the most devastating encirclements of the entire war. At the heart of Barbarossa lay Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. With the most powerful concentration of panzer divisions under Generals Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, its task was to thrust through Belarus, capture Smolensk, and then strike for Moscow itself. The opening days saw catastrophic defeats for the Soviets. Entire armies were encircled in massive pincer movements. At Białystok and Minsk, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were trapped. In barely 2 weeks, Army Group Center destroyed much of the Soviet Western Front, taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners and leaving the road to Moscow seemingly open. Yet geography and logistics began to weigh heavily. The further the Germans advanced, the more stretched their supply lines became. Soviet resistance, though costly, grew more organized. At Smolensk in July, the Red Army mounted desperate counterattacks. Though the city eventually fell, the Soviet stand delayed the Germans for weeks, buying precious time for Moscow's defenses to be reinforced. Here, Hitler and his generals faced a critical strategic decision. Should they continue the drive on Moscow or divert forces north and south to secure Leningrad and Ukraine first? This debate would haunt the German war effort, creating divisions within the high command and ultimately delaying the fatal blow against Moscow. In the first weeks of Barbarossa, the Soviet Union appeared on the brink of collapse. Millions of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire air fleets were destroyed. German columns advanced hundreds of kilometers deep into Soviet territory. Stalin himself was stunned by the scale of the disaster. Yet the Soviet system did not collapse. Factories in threatened areas began an extraordinary evacuation eastward, dismantled piece by piece and shipped to the Urals. The Red Army, though battered, continued to raise new divisions. Soviet propaganda invoked the Great Patriotic War, framing the struggle as one for survival against a merciless invader. Ordinary citizens joined militias, building defenses, digging trenches, and preparing for sieges. The sheer vastness of Soviet territory, combined with the determination of its people, began to blunt the German momentum. Though the Wehrmacht still seemed unstoppable, every delay, every counterattack, every mile of advance exacted a heavy toll. From the beginning, Barbarossa was not merely a military campaign, it was a war of annihilation. German orders explicitly called for the destruction of the Soviet state and the extermination of perceived racial and political enemies. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed in the wake of the army, massacring Jews, communists, and civilians. Villages were burned, prisoners executed, and starvation policies enforced. For millions of Soviet civilians, the invasion meant terror and death. In the Baltic states, Belarus, and Ukraine, entire communities were wiped out. The brutality of the war deepened Soviet resolve. Surrender was not an option when the alternative was extermination. This savage reality made Barbarossa unlike any campaign the world had seen. It was a clash of ideologies as much as armies. Fascism against communism, conquest against survival. By August 1941, after 2 months of fighting, German forces had advanced deep into Soviet territory. Army Group North near the outskirts of Leningrad. Army Group South pressed on Kyiv. Army Group Center prepared for the next stage toward Moscow. Yet time was slipping away. Hitler had promised victory before the onset of winter, but Soviet resistance had already disrupted those plans. The Wehrmacht, though triumphant in many battles, had failed to deliver the quick, decisive victory it had achieved in Poland or France. Instead, Barbarossa was transforming into a war of attrition, one for which Germany was ill-prepared. The coming months would see even greater battles, enormous encirclements, and the first signs that the Soviet Union, though wounded, would not fall. The invasion that Hitler believed would end in weeks had instead unleashed a struggle of unimaginable scale, one that would ultimately decide the fate of Europe. The summer of 1941 witnessed some of the most dramatic and devastating battles in history. The Wehrmacht swept across the Soviet frontier, capturing vast territories and millions of prisoners. Yet the Red Army, despite catastrophic losses, refused to collapse. From Leningrad in the north to Kyiv in the south, and before the gates of Moscow in the center, the Soviet Union stood and fought. Operation Barbarossa, conceived as a lightning strike, was already faltering. Instead of victory, Germany faced a brutal war of attrition, fought across endless plains and in the hearts of millions. The greatest land invasion in history had begun, but its outcome was far from certain.